You wouldn't necessarily know it from media coverage, which has really lost a lot of interest in this conflict, but the war in Ukraine is far and away the #1 priority of the U.S. foreign policy community, of the CIA and of NATO. Winning in Ukraine has become something on which the United States and its European allies have staked a great deal of credibility. They have invested an enormous amount of weaponry and enormous amount of their citizens' resources. Over the last several months, there has been a growing amount of concern and distrust in the ability of Ukraine to win this war. There has been a growing sense in Western populations that they were somewhat misled and deceived about the likelihood that Ukraine can win this war. They were told that oftentimes the Russian military was on the verge of collapse, and as populations started to turn against the war and against the commitment of endless amounts of resources, which are really starting to affect negatively the quality of life of people in the United States and multiple other European countries, a propagandistic campaign was launched to convince everybody that change was on the way, that victory was around the corner in the form of a vaunted counteroffensive, which we were told would involve the Ukrainians gathering a great deal of sophisticated Western weaponry, being trained in that, and then being able to use it to break through the entrenched front line again of Russia, which is very formidable. If you look at a map, it covers hundreds of miles in eastern Ukraine into southern Ukraine, and we were told that the key to Ukrainian victory is to break through those front lines, sever Crimea from the rest of the supply line, and then finally be able to expel Russia from the 20 to 25% of Ukrainian territory that they are now not just occupying, but occupying in a very fortified and in a defensive way. And for months we were hearing this counteroffensive was coming. It was the thing on which we should rely in order to be assured that the dynamic of the war was about to be transformed. And yet very quickly, Western media outlets felt compelled to tone down expectations because as soon as the counteroffensive began, it was very obvious that it was going to be anything but an easy success. Within the first week, there was an enormous amount of military equipment provided by Western governments, particularly tanks, that at one point we were told was going to change the dynamic of the war. An enormous number of them that were just sitting in the battlefield, open and destroyed. German tanks and American tanks alike. And over the last several months, there have been so few advances, so little territory retaken by the Ukrainian military that the Western media is resorting to celebrating whenever they take tiny little villages, even ones composed of literally 6 or 7 or 10 houses or 3 or 4 blocks. That's how much of a slog it is. And all along, the number of Ukrainian soldiers who are being killed as the Ukrainians try and probe where the vulnerabilities are in the Russian defensive lines is starting to skyrocket to extremely disturbing numbers. And remember, one of the main disadvantages Ukraine has had from the very beginning is simply a matter of available people to fight. Russia is a much bigger country in terms of population, therefore it has many more men of fighting age than Ukraine. That is an enormous advantage in a war of attrition of this type, on top of which the Ukrainians have experienced an artillery shortage from the very beginning that the United States is not able to fill because for all kinds of complicated reasons that I think ought to disturb us, we spend almost $1 trillion a year on our military, more than the next 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 countries combined, and yet apparently we don't have enough artillery to supply the Ukrainians in a way that the Russians are able to supply themselves, and that has been outcome determinative in this war so far. So we are now at the point where even the biggest boosters of the U.S. role in the war in Ukraine, Western corporate media outlet, U.S. intelligence officials, and increasingly even the Ukrainians themselves are now starting to acknowledge that the counteroffensive, if not yet a failure, an irretrievable failure, is most definitely something that has failed to meet every expectation by a significant margin. So So just to give you a taste for how extreme are these concessions, here is the Washington Post, which, needless to say, has been a cheerleader of this war from the start on August 17th. The headline is, U.S. intelligence says Ukraine will fail to meet offensive's key goals. Not some of the goals, but the key goals. Quote, Ukraine launched the counteroffensive in early June, hoping to replicate its stunning success in last fall's push through the Kharkiv region. But in the first week of fighting, Ukraine incurred major casualties against Russia's well-prepared defenses, despite having a range of newly acquired Western equipment, including U.S. Bradley fighter vehicles, German-made Leopard 2 tanks, and specialized mine-clearing vehicles. Joint war games conducted by the U.S., British, and Ukrainian militaries anticipated such losses, but envisioned Kiev accepting the casualties as the cost of piercing through Russia's main defensive lines, said U.S. and Western officials. So this is a very grim assessment, not even mincing words, just right from the beginning saying this counteroffensive is failing by every key metric. The New York Times on August 18th gave a sense for how significant the carnage on both sides of the war is now starting to be, how these deaths and casualties are starting to mount in ways that are almost definitely undercounted and yet still horrific. There you see the headline, troop deaths and injuries in Ukraine war, near 500,000 people, U.S. officials say. Quote, the total number of Ukrainian and Russian troops killed or wounded since the war in Ukraine began 18 months ago is nearing 500,000, U.S. officials said, a staggering toll as Russia assaults its next-door neighbor and tries to seize more territory. In the first 2 weeks of the counteroffensive, as much as 20% of the weaponry Ukraine sent to the battlefield was damaged or destroyed, according to U.S. and European officials. The losses included some of the most formidable Western fighting machines, tanks and armored personnel carriers that the Ukrainians were counting on to beat back the Russians. American officials are worried that Ukraine's adjustments will race through precious ammunition supplies, which could benefit President Vladimir Putin of Russia and disadvantage Ukraine in a war of attrition. But Ukrainian commanders decided to pivot, reduce casualties, and preserve their front lines fighting force. Now, here is a part of the media account that I find absolutely extraordinary. So in that paragraph, the New York Times just got done saying that one of the reasons why Ukraine has adjusted its strategy that the United States was hoping it would pursue to break through Russian entrenched defensive positions is because their casualty count has been so shockingly high that they're running out of people to fight. And just morally, they're watching thousands and thousands and thousands of Ukrainian troops being killed every week as part of this counteroffensive. The Russians have mined this territory to such an extent that military analysts say they haven't seen this kind of defensive mining since at least several decades ago. And so just in order to have any chance to even probe the entrenched Russian positions ensures that huge numbers of Ukrainian troops will die. And this is one of the reasons why Ukrainian men are starting to desperately try and avoid being sent to the front lines or fighting at all, why they're trying to bribe Ukrainian officials to get out of Ukraine or risking their life to do so, because they know that enlisting or fighting means being used as cannon fodder. That's what cannon fodder is, when you purposely send troops into a certain combat position knowing that they're likely to die, but needing them to do that in order to just test where some vulnerabilities might be. So you just offer them up and see which ones get killed and how and where. You send them kind of in defenseless or against mines. And the Ukrainian government is starting to kind of recoil at this and say, we don't want to keep pursuing a strategy where such a huge percentage of our population is being slaughtered with not much difficulty. Remember, this is supposed to be a war to protect Ukraine, to protect Ukrainians. And it's very difficult to maintain that's the purpose of the war when the strategy the Americans are insisting that they use is one that automatically ensured that huge number of Ukrainians are being killed seemingly for little purpose. And here's a line that I want you to really focus on in terms of what its meaning is. It kind of is expressed in a kind of cold New York Times-ese jargon, but if you really think about what it means and the amorality of it, and what it really reveals about the American view of this war, I think it should disturb any decent person, regardless of your view of what this war, of what your view of this war has been. Quote, American officials say they fear that Ukraine has become casualty averse. One reason it has been cautious about pressing ahead with the counteroffensive. So they see that the Ukrainian government doesn't want their people, including people who don't want to be fighting, to be slaughtered in large numbers. And now the Americans are upset about this. They're worried about this. They're calling that casualty averse, which, if you strip down the euphemism, means the Ukrainian government is trying to prevent even more of its citizens who have already been killed in the hundreds of thousands from dying in a war effort they're starting increasingly to believe is futile. And the Americans are upset about this. They want more and more waves of Ukrainian troops being sent to those front lines and dying to try and test the Russian defenses. So you have Americans saying outright they fear that Ukraine has become casualty averse. What kind of moral government is not averse to casualties? The New York Times goes on, quote, almost any big push against Thuggin Russian defenders protected by minefields would result in huge numbers of losses. And that's the point. The Russians have had months. If you look at a map, which we're about to show you, the front line has really remained unchanged for months. They occupied, the Russians do, large swaths of eastern Ukraine. The region of Ukraine they vowed they wanted to protect because that's where a lot of ethnic-speaking Russians are, who they felt were being increasingly mistreated. That, of course, is where there has been fighting for 8 years. This war did not start in February of 2022. It started in 2014 when the U.S. helped Western Europeans remove the democratically elected president before his term was up, and Victoria Nuland picked the next government. And the people in eastern Ukraine decided they didn't want to be subject to an illegitimate government in Kiev, and they started waging a war for autonomy or for separatism that the Russians had been backing. And they were essentially fighting against the Azov Battalion and other extremist nationalists, or as the media has long called them, neo-Nazi battalions. And that was Putin's argument for invading Ukraine, was we need once and for all to create a buffer between our country and these neo-Nazi militias that are assaulting and degrading and mistreating Russian-speaking ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. So the Russians have achieved a big part of their goal of occupying and now, according to them, permanently annexing these parts of eastern Ukraine, these provinces, as well as fortifying their control over Crimea. And the whole time that this has been going on, they have been circulating and surrounding themselves with minefields filled with a number of mines unseen in a long time that make it almost impossible for the Ukrainians to breach it unless they're willing to sacrifice huge numbers of young men that don't want to fight and that they don't really have to sacrifice any longer. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.